The Sterling Steakhouse stood proudly in downtown Chicago, its warm golden lights reflecting off the snow-covered sidewalks. It wasn't just any restaurant, it was the kind of place where a dinner bill could easily run into hundreds of dollars, where wealthy business people closed million-dollar deals over perfectly cooked steaks and expensive wine. On this particular Friday evening, the restaurant buzzed with its usual elegant energy. The smell of perfectly seared meat filled the air, mixing with the subtle scent of freshly baked bread and truffle oil. Crystal glasses clinked gently, and the soft murmur of conversation floated through the dimly lit dining room. Among the wait staff that evening was Amy Chen, a bright-eyed young woman with dreams bigger than the fancy plates she carried. At 23, she wasn't just any waitress, she was a future doctor working double shifts to pay her way through medical school. Her fellow workers knew her as the girl who could recite medical terms while balancing 3 plates of food, the one who studied anatomy textbooks during her breaks. The night was going smoothly until table 17. That's where Robert Wilson sat, a man whose name appeared regularly in Chicago's business magazines. He built a real estate empire worth millions, but money hadn't bought him manners. The other servers had warned Emmy about him, how he'd made 3 different waiters cry last month alone. Medium rare, he'd ordered his steak, barely looking up from his phone, his voice carrying that familiar tone of someone who was used to always getting exactly what they wanted. Emmy had carefully repeated the order back to him, making sure every detail was perfect. But sometimes, even in the finest restaurants, things don't go exactly as planned. The kitchen was slammed that night, with every table full and private events in both banquet rooms. When Emmy brought out Wilson's steak, she could tell something was off even before he cut into it. The meat was a touch more done than it should have been, closer to medium than medium rare. It was the kind of minor imperfection that most people would mention politely, get a quick apology, and have a fresh steak brought out. But Wilson wasn't most people. His reaction started slowly, like a storm gathering strength. First came the cold stare as he cut into the steak, then the dramatic sigh as he held up the piece of meat on his fork, examining it like a jeweler studying a fake diamond. "Do you see this?" he asked, his voice rising above the restaurant's gentle murmur. "Do you have any idea how much I'm paying for this?" Emmy stayed professional, apologizing smoothly and offering to have the kitchen prepare a new steak right away. She'd handled difficult customers before, it was part of the job, but nothing had prepared her for what happened next. Wilson's face turned red, his features twisting with an... For a second, nobody moved. It was as if someone had pressed pause on the whole restaurant. Then came the gasps, the scraping of chairs as people stood up, and the sudden flash of phone cameras. A businessman from the next table jumped to his feet, positioning himself between Amy and Wilson. An elderly woman rushed to Amy's side, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. Wilson stood there, his hand still raised, seeming almost surprised by what he'd just done. Perhaps he'd never crossed this line before, or perhaps he'd just never done it with so many witnesses. Either way, he was about to learn that actions have consequences, even for millionaires. The restaurant's owner, David Park, appeared as if the next few minutes in the Sterling Steakhouse felt like watching a movie in slow motion. The echo of that slap seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the sounds of shocked gasps and chairs scraping against hardwood floors. But what happened next showed exactly how one moment of cruelty could bring out both the worst and best in people. Mrs. Rodriguez, a grandmother celebrating her 60th birthday at the next table, was the first to reach Emmy. Without hesitation, she wrapped her silk shawl around the young waitress's shoulders, her warm hands steadying Amy's trembling ones. "Me here," she whispered, "you stand tall. Don't let him see you cry." Meanwhile, Tom Baker, a construction worker treating his wife to their 10th anniversary dinner, had positioned himself between Wilson and Amy. He wasn't a particularly large man, but there was something about the quiet determination in his stance that made even the entitled millionaire take a step back. "I think you should leave," Tom said, his voice firm but controlled. Now, he wasn't alone. Other diners were standing up too, forming a protective circle around Amy. It was a powerful sight. People from all walks of life, strangers just moments ago, united in their outrage. Wilson, perhaps realizing for the first time that his wealth couldn't shield him from everything, tried to regain control of the situation the only way he knew how, by reaching for his wallet. "Look," he said, pulling out a thick stack of $100 bills, "let's handle this reasonably. I'm willing to be generous about this misunderstanding." The restaurant's owner, David Park, pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of controlled anger. He'd built the Sterling Steakhouse from nothing, working his way up from dishwasher to owner over 20 years. In all that time, he'd never seen anything like this. "Mr. Wilson," Park's voice cut through the tension like a knife, "I need you to leave my restaurant immediately. You are permanently banned from this establishment." He turned to his security team, who had already positioned themselves near the exits. "Please escort this gentleman out. And make sure to get his photo. He won't be welcome back." But the real drama was unfolding in the palms of dozens of witnesses. Phones had captured everything: the unprovoked attack, Wilson's attempt to buy his way out, the community's response. Within minutes, videos were being uploaded to social media platforms. The hashtag Sterling Stakeout was already trending locally. A young law student dining at the bar had caught the whole thing in perfect clarity on her phone. "This is going viral," she announced, looking at her screen. 3,000 shares already. She walked over to Amy, her card extended. "I'm in my final year at Chicago Law. Call me, this isn't over." The kitchen staff had emerged too, led by head chef Michael O'Brien, who had worked with Amy for the past year. They formed a solid wall of white uniforms, their faces showing a mix of concern and determination. "We got your back," Michael said simply, handing Amy an ice pack wrapped in a clean kitchen towel. As Wilson was escorted out, his expensive suit couldn't hide how small he suddenly looked. The man who had walked in as a feared and respected business tycoon was leaving as something else entirely, someone whose true character had been exposed in front of dozens of witnesses and soon millions of online viewers. Outside, a small crowd had already gathered. News traveled fast in downtown Chicago, especially when it involved one of the city's most prominent businessmen. Local news vans were pulling up, their reporters practically running toward the restaurant with microphones ready. Back inside, Amy sat in the manager's office, surrounded by concerned coworkers and customers who insisted on giving their contact information as potential witnesses. Her cheek was red, but her eyes were clear and determined. She'd come to America with dreams of becoming a doctor, working double shifts to pay for medical school. Now, looking at the supportive faces around her and listening to the gentle encouragement of Mrs. Rodriguez, who refused to leave her side, she realized she had accidentally become something else too, a symbol. The police arrived within minutes, their presence adding another layer of seriousness to the situation. As they took statements from witnesses, it became clear that this wasn't going to be brushed under the rug like so many similar incidents before it. Too many people had seen it, too many had recorded it. Too many were invested in seeing justice done. David Park had already called the restaurant's lawyer, but he wasn't just thinking about legal protection. He was thinking about Amy, about all his employees, about the message this would send. Standing in his office, looking at the security footage that had captured everything in crystal clear detail, he made a decision. "We're not settling this quietly," he announced to the room. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, we're going to see this through." He looked at Amy, his voice softening. "If you're willing to fight, we're all behind you." Outside, the city was already buzzing with the news. The video was spreading across social media platforms like wildfire, accompanied by thousands of comments, shares, and calls for justice. Local news stations were breaking into their regular programming to report on the incident. What had started as a normal Friday night at an upscale steakhouse had become something much bigger. A moment that would spark conversations about privilege, respect, and the treatment of service workers across the country. And it was only the beginning. By Monday morning, the incident at the Sterling Steakhouse had exploded across the nation. Amy's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications, and news vans were camped outside her small apartment building. The video of the assault had been viewed millions of times, and #JusticeForAmy was trending nationwide. In his glass-walled office on the 40th floor of downtown Chicago, Wilson sat with his team of expensive lawyers, watching his empire start to crumble in real time. His phone had been ringing nonstop too, but with a very different kind of call. Business partners wanting to distance themselves, clients canceling contracts, journalists asking for comments. His PR team had drafted 5 different apology statements, but none of them felt right. probably because they weren't genuine. Just throw money at it, Wilson demanded, pacing back and forth across his designer carpet. Everyone has a price. Send her team an offer, start with $500,000. He still didn't get it. He thought this was just another problem he could solve with his checkbook. But Amy had already found her voice, and it was louder than Wilson's money. Lisa Taylor, one of Chicago's top civil rights attorneys, had reached out to offer her services. She wasn't just any lawyer. She was known for taking on powerful people and winning. More importantly, she was known for refusing to settle cases that deserved their day in court. Your story isn't just about you anymore, Lisa explained to Amy, sitting in her modest office filled with case files and law books. It's about every person who's ever been humiliated by someone who thought their money made them untouchable. We can make real change here. The evidence was overwhelming. Besides the viral video, there were dozens of witness statements. The restaurant's security cameras had captured the incident from 3 different angles. But what really strengthened the case was when other victims started coming forward. A valet from another upscale restaurant shared security footage of Wilson shoving him 2 months ago. A flight attendant came forward with a written complaint about Wilson's aggressive behavior on a first-class flight. Former employees began speaking out about years of verbal abuse and intimidation. Pattern of behavior, Lisa explained to Amy, spreading documents across her desk. This wasn't a one-time loss of temper. This was who he is, and now everyone can see it. Wilson's legal team tried every trick in the book. They claimed Amy had provoked him. The videos proved otherwise. They tried to dig up dirt from her past. There wasn't any. They even attempted to blame the restaurant for overserving him alcohol. He'd only had 1 glass of wine. The criminal case moved first. The district attorney's office, under public pressure and armed with clear evidence, charged Wilson with assault and battery. The enhancement for bias-motivated crime was added after witnesses reported hearing his discriminatory remarks during the incident. But it was the civil lawsuit that really got Wilson's attention. Lisa Taylor filed a comprehensive case seeking not just compensatory damages, but punitive damages designed to send a message. The number was big enough to make even a millionaire nervous, $10 million. "You're going to bankrupt me," Wilson complained during his deposition, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "No, Mr. Wilson," Lisa replied calmly, "you did this to yourself." The pretrial hearings became media events. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse holding signs with messages like "Stand with Amy" and "Money can't buy justice." Local restaurants started offering Amy specials, with proceeds going to a fund for service workers facing workplace abuse. Wilson's lawyers tried to get the case moved to a different venue, claiming he couldn't get a fair trial in Chicago. The judge, a former waitress who had worked her way through law school, denied their motion. "The defendant's actions have attracted attention because they deserve attention," she wrote in her decision. Amy's medical school professors were understanding about her missed classes, even offering to help her study between court appearances. Her classmates organized study groups to help her keep up. The support was overwhelming, but also necessary, because this fight was taking everything she had. The stress was visible on Wilson too. His perfectly tailored suits couldn't hide how the pressure was affecting him. His hair had gone grayer, his face more lined. During a lunch break in the proceedings, someone overheard him asking his lawyer, "Can't we just make this go away?" But Lisa Taylor had prepared Amy for this moment. "They'll try to weigh you down," she had warned. "They'll make offers that sound too good to refuse. But remember, this isn't just about money anymore. This is about dignity, about consequences, about changing how people treat each other." Amy understood. Every time she felt tired or overwhelmed, she thought about her parents back home, who had taught her to stand up for what was right. She thought about all the other service workers who dealt with abuse and couldn't fight back. She thought about the future doctors and lawyers and teachers who were working service jobs to pay for their education, just like her. As the case moved toward trial, something unexpected happened. People started sharing their own stories of workplace abuse and standing up to power. Amy's case had sparked a movement. Local governments began reviewing their laws about workplace harassment. Restaurant associations started drafting new policies to protect their workers. Wilson's lawyers made one last attempt at settlement, pushing a check across the table with 7 zeros on it. Amy looked at it for a long moment, then at Lisa, who nodded supportively. Whatever decision Amy made, she would back her up. Amy took a deep breath, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Then she did something that would change not just her life, but the lives of countless others. She pushed the check back across the table. "No," she said quietly but firmly. "We're going to trial. They say it takes a lifetime to build a reputation and only a moment to destroy it." For Robert Wilson, that moment had lasted exactly 8 seconds, the time it took for him to lose his temper and strike Amy Chen at the Sterling Steakhouse. Now he was watching 30 years of carefully built success crumble like a sandcastle in high tide. The first blow came from his biggest client, Sun Valley Development Group. Their CEO didn't even call, just sent a simple email. "In light of recent events, we're terminating all contracts with Wilson Properties effective immediately." That single email cost him $30 million in future projects. Wilson sat in his home office, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, and watched his phone light up with more bad news. The morning news showed footage of protesters outside his company's headquarters. His secretary had quit, along with 3 senior executives. The charity he'd chaired for a decade politely asked him to step down. "It's just temporary," he tried telling himself, pouring his 3rd glass of scotch before noon. "They'll forget about it. They always do." But deep down, he knew this time was different. The world had changed, and actions that might have been brushed aside a few years ago now had real consequences. His wife, Linda, who had stood by him through countless business battles and social scandals, packed her bags that Wednesday. "I've spent 28 years making excuses for you," she said, her voice tired rather than angry. "I can't do it anymore." She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, next to a newspaper with his face on the front page. The Preston Heights Country Club, where Wilson had been a member for 2 decades, sent him a letter revoking his membership. He'd closed million-dollar deals on that golf course, hosted charity events there, celebrated his daughter's wedding on its perfectly manicured lawn. Now he couldn't even get past the front gate. His daughter called from Boston. "Dad, how could you?" She was crying. "My friends are asking me if I was raised by a monster. My kids, your grandchildren, saw that video. What am I supposed to tell them?" Wilson had no answer for her. He'd always taught his children about working hard and being successful, but he'd never thought to teach them about being kind. Now he wondered if he'd known how. The business world can be surprisingly small, especially at the top. Wilson started noticing how his usual lunch spots were suddenly fully booked when he called. Old friends stopped returning his calls. Even his barber of 15 years said he couldn't fit him in anymore. One morning, he decided to visit his office, thinking work might help him feel normal again. But as he walked through the lobby of his own building, people turned away. The security guard who had greeted him cheerfully every morning for years suddenly became very interested in his computer screen. In the elevator, 2 young employees got off when he got on, even though they were clearly going up. His company's stock was in free fall. Investors were pulling out, partners were distancing themselves, and projects were being cancelled. The board called an emergency meeting. Wilson sat at the head of the table where he'd sat for countless meetings before, but this time felt different. They voted him out of his own company, the company he'd built from nothing. "It's not personal," his CFO said, not meeting his eyes. "It's just business." Wilson almost laughed at hearing his own words thrown back at him. The media was relentless. Every news channel seemed to be running the story. They dug up old complaints, interviewed former employees, painted a picture of a man who had let power and money corrupt him completely. Someone spray-painted "BULLI" on his garage door. Another day, he found his car keyed in the parking lot of his favorite restaurant, or what used to be his favorite restaurant, before they too asked him not to return. His lawyer suggested a public apology, but every time Wilson sat down to write one, the words felt hollow. How do you apologize for something you've been doing your whole life? How do you say sorry when you're only really sorry about getting caught? The final blow came from his bank. They called in his loans, citing a character clause in the contract. Without new investors willing to work with him, And with his assets frozen pending the civil lawsuit, Wilson found himself facing something he'd never imagined possible: financial ruin. Late one night, sitting alone in his empty house, Wilson found himself watching the video again. He saw himself through the world's eyes, not as the powerful businessman he thought he was, but as a bully picking on someone who was just trying to do their job. He saw the look of shock and hurt on Amy's face, the disgust in the eyes of the other diners, the way his own face twisted with an ugliness that had nothing to do with physical appearance. For the first time in his life, Robert Wilson felt truly alone. His money couldn't help him. His connections couldn't save him. His power had evaporated like morning dew in the summer sun. All he had left was time. Time to think about how he'd gotten here and whether there was any way back from this fall from grace. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his whole life climbing to the top, only to find that the view from up there had blinded him to what was really important. Now, as he watched his empire crumble, he was finally beginning to see things clearly. But was it too late for such clarity to matter? While Wilson's world was falling apart, Amy Chen's life was taking an unexpected turn. The video of the incident had struck a chord with people across the country, but it wasn't just the assault they were talking about anymore. It was her response to it, her dignity, and her determination to stand up for what was right. One morning, as Amy was studying for her medical school exams in her tiny apartment, her phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had started a GoFundMe page for her medical school expenses. She clicked on it, expecting maybe a few $100s in donations. Her coffee mug almost slipped from her hands when she saw the number, $50,000. And it was still climbing. "You don't know me," read one comment with a $50 donation, "but I've been a waitress for 15 years. Thank you for standing up for all of us." Another donor wrote, "My daughter works in food service to pay for college. You're showing her that she deserves respect." The messages kept coming, along with the donations. By evening, the fund had reached $100,000. Local news stations wanted interviews. National morning shows were calling. But Amy had an organic chemistry exam the next day, and that still came first. She turned off her phone and went back to her textbooks, just as she'd done every night since starting medical school. Her story caught the attention of Dr. Patricia Wong, a prominent surgeon and dean at one of Chicago's top medical schools. "I worked as a waitress too, all through college and med school," Dr. Wong told her during a surprise visit to the restaurant, where Amy still insisted on completing her shifts. "Your dedication to both your work and your education, that's exactly the kind of doctor we need." The next day, Amy received an email that made her hands shake. The medical school was offering her a full scholarship. "In recognition of your character, resilience, and commitment to justice," the letter read. But it wasn't just one school. 3 other medical schools across the country made similar offers. The restaurant industry started paying attention too. The National Restaurant Association invited Amy to speak at their annual conference about workplace safety and respect. Standing at the podium in front of hundreds of restaurant owners and managers, Amy spoke from her heart. "I'm not just a waitress," she told them, her voice clear and strong. "I'm a future doctor. The person serving your food might be a future teacher, lawyer, or business owner. Every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their job title." The speech went viral. Small restaurants started putting up signs, "All customers welcome," "All workers respected." Large restaurant chains began revising their policies on customer behavior and worker protection. A nationwide movement was growing, and Amy found herself accidentally at its center. But success didn't change her. She still showed up for her shifts at the Sterling Steakhouse, now wearing a name tag that read, "Amy Chen, Future MD." Regular customers would request her section, not because she was famous, but because she remained the same caring, efficient server she always been. One busy night, a little girl tugged on Amy's apron while she was carrying plates. "My mom says you're going to be a doctor," the girl said shyly. "I want to be a doctor too." Amy knelt down to eye level with her young admirer. "You can be anything you want to be," she told her. "Just remember to be kind along the way." The support wasn't just emotional, it was practical. Study groups formed around her work schedule. When she had to miss classes for court appearances, her classmates recorded lectures and shared detailed notes. Her professors offered extra office hours to help her stay on track. Mrs. Rodriguez, the grandmother who had comforted her on that fateful night, became a regular at the restaurant. She'd bring her knitting and sit at the counter during Amy's shifts, a quiet but steady presence. "You remind me of my daughter," she'd say, sharing homemade cookies with the staff. "She's a pediatrician now. Started just like you, working hard, staying strong." The old Amy might have felt overwhelmed by all the attention, but something had changed inside her. Each supportive message, each kind gesture, each story shared by another service worker, they all helped her find her voice. She started a blog about her journey from waitress to medical student, sharing study tips and stories about balancing work with education. Local businesses joined the movement. A scrubs company donated her first set of medical uniforms. A local bookstore gave her a gift card for textbooks. A coffee shop near the hospital where she did her clinical rotations started a pay-it-forward board where customers could prepay for drinks for medical students and service workers. But perhaps the most meaningful change was happening in the restaurant itself. New servers would ask to train with Amy, not just to learn about taking orders and carrying plates, but to learn about dignity and self-respect. She started an informal mentoring program, helping other servers who were also students navigate their demanding double lives. 1 year after the incident, Amy stood in front of a mirror, adjusting her white coat before her first hospital rotation. The path ahead was still long and challenging, but she wasn't walking it alone anymore. She had become more than just a symbol of standing up to power. She was proof that kindness could be stronger than money, that dignity could overcome discrimination, and that one person's courage could inspire change in countless lives. "Your hands were meant for healing," Mrs. Rodriguez had told her once, holding Amy's hands in her own weathered ones. Looking at her reflection, at the stethoscope around her neck, and the name tag that read Student Dr. Chen, Amy knew those words were true. Her hands would heal, her voice would encourage, and her story would continue to inspire others to stand up for what's right. The day of the verdict arrived with a weight of anticipation that could be felt throughout Chicago. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters, reporters, and curious onlookers. Some people had been camping out since dawn, holding signs and sharing stories about their own experiences with workplace discrimination. Inside the courtroom, Amy sat quietly beside her attorney, Lisa Taylor. She wore a simple blue dress, the same one she'd worn the day she got accepted to medical school. Her parents, who had flown in from California, sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of worry and pride. Behind them, dozens of restaurant workers had taken the day off to attend, many still in their uniforms. Wilson entered looking different from the powerful man who had stormed through the Sterling Steakhouse months ago. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame, and his hair had gone completely gray. His wife's seat beside him was empty. She had filed for divorce 2 weeks earlier, unable to stand by him after everything that had come to light during the trial. The evidence had been overwhelming. Security footage from 3 angles, dozens of witness testimonies, expert testimony about the psychological impact of workplace harassment. But what had really swayed the jury were the other victims who had come forward, former employees, service workers, and even other restaurant patrons who had experienced Wilson's abuse over the years. The jury had deliberated for just 4 hours, unusually quick for a case of this magnitude. As the forewoman stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell so silent you could hear the autumn rain pattering against the windows. In the criminal case of the state versus Robert Wilson, on the count of assault and battery with a hate crime enhancement, we find the defendant guilty. Wilson's shoulders slumped. His attorney placed a steadying hand on his arm. Additionally, the forewoman continued, "In the civil case of Chen versus Wilson, we find in favor of the plaintiff and award compensatory damages in the amount of $2 million and punitive damages in the amount of $3 million. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. $5 million. It was one of the largest verdicts ever awarded in a case of this kind. But the judge wasn't finished. Rising from her bench, she addressed Wilson directly. The young hostess working that night recognized her. "You know," she said, her eyes bright, "I just got accepted to nursing school. Seeing you stand up for yourself, it made me believe I could do it too." That night, Amy sat at the bar where she had spent so many breaks studying her medical textbooks. Chef Michael brought out her favorite dish, the one he used to prepare for her during long shifts. Her former co-workers gathered around, sharing stories and laughter. Looking around at these familiar faces, Amy realized something important. The verdict wasn't just about money or punishment. It was about dignity. It was about showing that every person, regardless of their job or position, deserved to be treated with respect. It was about proving that sometimes standing up for what's right could change not just one life, but many. As she left the restaurant that night, Amy paused to look at her reflection in the window. 5 years can change a person in ways they never expected. On a crisp autumn morning, Robert Wilson stood in front of a room full of high school students, sharing a story he once tried desperately to hide. His hair was completely white now, and he wore a simple button-down shirt instead of his once signature designer suits. "I thought money made me better than everyone else," he told the quiet classroom. "I thought it gave me the right to treat people however I wanted. I was wrong. It took losing everything to learn what really matters." The mandatory community service hours had ended years ago, but Wilson kept showing up. First at soup kitchens, then at community centers, and finally at schools, where he found his true calling, teaching young people about respect, dignity, and the dangers of unchecked privilege. His transformation hadn't been easy. The first few months in county jail had been a harsh wake-up call. He'd shared a cell with a former restaurant worker who'd lost everything to addiction. Night after night, he'd listened to his cellmates' stories about working 3 jobs to support his family, about customers who treated him like he wasn't even human. After his release, Wilson had thrown himself into his community service with unexpected dedication. At first, people were skeptical. They thought it was just for show. But something had genuinely changed in him. He started a foundation called Second Chance Serves, using what remained of his fortune to provide scholarships for service industry workers pursuing higher education. The foundation's first office was a far cry from his old corporate headquarters, just a small room above a coffee shop. But it was there that he met Tommy, a 19-year-old barista dreaming of becoming a teacher. Wilson helped him apply for college, wrote him a recommendation letter, and celebrated when he got accepted. Tommy was now in his final year of teaching school, planning to work in underprivileged communities. Meanwhile, across town, Dr. Amy Chen adjusted her white coat before starting her rounds at Chicago General Hospital. She'd graduated from medical school with honors, but chose to work in a community hospital rather than a prestigious private practice. Her patient waiting room had a special sign: "Every person deserves care and respect." The incident that had brought them both to this point was now a case study in law schools and business ethics classes. But the real impact could be seen in smaller, more personal ways. Restaurants across the country had adopted strict anti-harassment policies. Service workers were more likely to report abuse, knowing the law was on their side. Customer behavior had slowly but surely begun to change. One rainy Tuesday, Annie was grabbing coffee at her favorite cafe when she spotted a familiar face. Wilson was sitting alone, reading through scholarship applications. She hadn't seen him since the trial, and for a moment she hesitated. But something in his posture, humble, almost apologetic, made her walk over. "May I join you?" she asked. Wilson looked up, startled. The last time they'd been this close, he'd been in handcuffs. He gestured to the empty chair, his hands trembling slightly. "I've wanted to tell you something for a long time," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for who I was. You changed my life by standing up to me. You changed a lot of lives." Emmy stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "I hear about your foundation," she said. "You're doing good work." They talked for an hour, about his scholarship program, about her work at the hospital, about how one moment had sent their lives in completely unexpected directions. As they spoke, other cafe workers and customers watched in amazement. The story of the Millionaire and the Waitress had become almost legendary in Chicago, but seeing them sitting together, talking like old friends, that was something no one had expected. Later that week, Annie was invited to speak at a fundraiser for Wilson's foundation. Standing at the podium, looking out at a room full of service workers and their families, she felt a sense of completion. 5 years ago, I was a waitress working to become a doctor, she began. Today, I am a doctor who was once a waitress. And I'm proud of both those things, because every job deserves respect. Every person deserves dignity. And sometimes, the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most beautiful changes. Wilson sat in the audience, nodding quietly. He'd lost his empire, but he'd gained something more valuable: understanding. His foundation had helped send over 50 service workers to college. Each success story was a small step toward redemption. The Sterling Steakhouse was still there, now famous for more than just its food. The spot where the incident happened had been turned into a special table, the Respect Table, where once a month, service workers were treated to a free dinner in recognition of their hard work. Mrs. Rodriguez still came in regularly, now accompanied by her grandchildren. She'd tell them the story of the night everything changed, about standing up for what's right, about how one person's courage could ripple out and touch countless lives. And in medical schools across the country, a new generation of doctors was emerging, former waiters, bartenders, and busboys who'd received scholarships from Wilson's foundation. They brought something special to their practice, an understanding that every person, regardless of their position in life, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The story of the millionaire who slapped a waitress had evolved into something none of them could have predicted. A story of redemption, of growth, and of the power of forgiveness. It proved that change was possible, that it's never too late to become a better person, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our biggest mistakes. As Emmy finished her speech that night, she looked out at the room full of hopeful faces and smiled. "We're all writing our own stories," she concluded. "Make sure yours is one that helps others write better endings to theirs."